It happened inside the bubble, a small control room meant for officers to monitor the housing units in Rikers Island's George R. Vierno Center. But on that day, the bubble wasn't under the officers' control. It was under the gangs. Surveillance cameras showed a young inmate dragged across the floor, surrounded by 5 others. They were no uniforms, just sneakers, white tees, and makeshift masks torn from bedsheets. They called themselves the Trinitarios, one of the most feared Dominican gangs in New York. For 30 straight seconds, fists and boots crashed down. One inmate tried to crawl toward the gate. Another blocked the camera with a towel, so the beating stayed hidden. Correction officers watched, but did nothing. Why? Because inside Rikers Island, sometimes even the guards have to follow the island rules. Rules written not by the Department of Corrections, but by the gangs who run the blocks. How did the gangs get this much power? And what happens when someone breaks the island rules? Let's go back to where it all began. Rikers Island, a 413-acre jail complex sitting on the East River between the Bronx and Queens. It was built to hold short-term inmates awaiting trial. But over the years, it became something else. A pressure cooker of violence, overcrowding, and chaos. At one point, more than 10,000 people were locked inside. Every housing unit had its own hierarchy, its own laws. By the early 2000s, gangs had quietly replaced correction officers as the true power. Bloods, Crips, Latin Kings, Trinitarios. Even smaller crews like the Macballers and Guerrilla Stone Nation carved out their corners of control. Each group ran their dorms through a system called the program. If you wanted to live peacefully, eat, or even use the phone, you had to check in with whoever ran that block. New inmates, especially young ones, were given a choice: join a crew or get pressed. At first glance, you'd think the officers run the jail. But talk to anyone who's worked there long enough. They'll tell you a different story. Many officers say they're outnumbered, underpaid, and undertrained. Some even rely on gang leaders to keep the peace. In interviews, former Rikers officers admitted that they sometimes let gang enforcers discipline inmates because it was safer than getting involved themselves. As one former captain put it, "You let the gang control the block, or the block controls you." And that's exactly what happened. Gang leaders used that space to build empires. They controlled phones, commissary trades, even the flow of contraband, cigarettes, weed, pills, blades. Everything had a price. And every price had to be paid in loyalty. Inside the cells, they held meetings, voted on punishments, and enforced their laws through cuttings, slashing faces with homemade razors melted into toothbrushes. Most of the inmates in Rikers are under 25. Many come from neighborhoods already split by gang lines. So when they enter Rikers, they're walking into enemy territory, and survival means finding protection fast. Recruiters are everywhere. They promise safety, food, a sense of belonging. But once you're in, getting out is almost impossible. One former inmate described it like this: "It's not a jail. It's a city run by gangs. You either work for them or you're food." For a while, the gangs maintained their version of order. They kept the peace, collected rent from weaker inmates, and handled disputes quietly. But when one gang loses respect or territory, blood spills fast. In 2015, after a crackdown removed several blood leaders from one of the main dorms, rival crews moved in. What followed was chaos, cuttings, stabbings, and attacks that left dozens hospitalized. Officers tried lockdowns. It didn't work. The gangs simply moved their communications through the phones, through hand signals, or through corrupt staff members. Soon, one housing unit fell completely under gang control. No officers dared step inside without backup. Inmates started calling it the program dorm. And what happened next would prove that the gangs didn't just control the cells, they controlled the entire rhythm of Rikers Island. A young inmate, just 18, refused to pay rent to the Trinitarios. He said he wasn't in a gang. He said he just wanted to do his time and leave. By the next morning, his bed was empty. No one saw him leave the dorm. But everyone heard what happened inside the showers. It started like every other morning on Rikers Island. The sound of the count. officers walking past cell after cell, marking each inmate present. But that morning, something didn't add up. In the Trinitario control dorm, one bunk was empty. The inmate assigned there, a young man named Luis Santiago, just 18, was gone. At first, the officers thought it was a mistake. Maybe he was moved. Maybe he was at medical. But within minutes, the whispers started spreading. He didn't leave, one inmate said quietly. They got him in the showers. In Rikers Island, every action sends a message. Luis had refused to pay rent, a weekly payment demanded by the gang that ran his dorm. Rent wasn't money. It was food, favors, protection, whatever they asked for. He told them no. He said, "I'm not part of your gang. I just want to stay out of it." That single act of defiance made him a target. For the gang, it wasn't about the rent anymore. It was about control, about showing everyone else what happens when someone breaks the island rules. According to multiple reports and later investigations, the Trinitarios pulled him into the shower area, where there were no cameras. There, they beat him until he stopped moving. When the officers finally entered, it was already too late. Luis was unresponsive, his body showing clear signs of assault. No one talked. No one saw anything. And within days, another inmate was assigned to his bed, and the cycle continued. Rikers Island runs on silence. The gangs call it the code. No snitching. No talking. No witnesses. If you break that code, you might not make it through the night. That's why even when serious assaults happen, and they happen often, few inmates are willing to come forward. In fact, according to city data, hundreds of assaults inside Rikers go unreported each year. And the ones that are reported often never lead to charges because witnesses refuse to testify. One former inmate put it this way: Rikers is like a world inside the world. Cops don't run it, fear does. To understand how deep that control runs, you have to look at how the gangs organize themselves inside. Each crew mirrors its street structure. There's a top dog, or OG, who acts as the boss. Below him are enforcers, known as soldiers. They handle discipline, collect rent, and make sure every inmate follows orders. Then you have associates, those who aren't officially in the gang, but help move goods or information. Together, they run Rikers like a small kingdom, one dorm at a time. Even the timing of showers, phone calls, and meal breaks can be dictated by who controls the block. If you're not in the right crew, you might not get to eat until last. You might not get to call your family. You might even lose your bed. Everything is about power and respect. And when one gang loses either, the whole jail can erupt. For the correction officers, the situation is a nightmare. Most are working 12 to 16-hour shifts, often with little backup. Some say they've been threatened. Others claim they've been targeted for trying to enforce the rules. One retired officer described it like this: "You can't control 100 inmates with 3 officers. So you make deals. You let the gangs keep order and hope they don't turn on you. That's how gangs keep power without firing a single shot. They build relationships, find weak points, and exploit fear, even among the staff. And in some rare cases, a few officers cross the line completely, smuggling in phones or drugs in exchange for cash or safety. Those phones become gang command centers, used to coordinate everything from assaults to outside hits. After Luis's death, officials launched an internal investigation, but it quickly went nowhere. The cameras didn't capture the attack. No inmates were willing to talk, and officers denied seeing anything. Within weeks, the case was closed as unsubstantiated. But behind the scenes, inmates knew the truth. Luis had become another name in the long list of people who paid the price for challenging gang control inside Rikers Island. And yet, something about his case started to ripple through the blocks. Whispers began to spread. A few younger inmates started questioning the system, asking why they had to follow rules written by gangs, not the law. And that's when things began to shift again. Because in a place like Rikers, questioning power is dangerous. And when someone finally tried to stand up, it set off one of the most violent chain reactions the jail had seen in years. An officer's voice yells, "Lock it down. Lock it down." Another inmate had just been found in the yard, beaten and slashed, his face cut from ear to mouth. And this time, it wasn't about rent. It was about revenge. It started with one attack in the yard, but it was only the beginning. The victim was a known Trinitario associate, ambushed by two Bloods who wanted payback for Luis's death. They said he'd been greenlit, marked for retaliation. By the time officers arrived, the attackers had already blended into the crowd. The yard was chaos, inmates running, guards shouting, the alarm echoing through the compound. But inside Rikers Island, everyone knew what was coming next. Revenge doesn't end with one fight. It starts a war. Within days, the entire jail was on edge. Every housing unit buzzed with rumors: who was next, which crew would strike, and whether lockdown was coming. The Bloods and Trinitarios began trading hits, one attack leading to another. Shanks made from toothbrushes and metal scraps appeared overnight. Messages moved through food trays and through the air vents. Phones, hidden in laundry bags or ceiling tiles, carried orders from one dorm to another. By the end of the week, there had been 7 slashings, 3 stabbings, and countless beatings. Rikers wasn't just a jail anymore. It was a war zone. The violence forced the Department of Correction to react. But instead of regaining control, lockdowns gave gangs more power. When officers stayed out of the dorms, gang leaders ran everything. They organized security shifts, assigning their own men to guard doors, distribute food, and decide who could leave their cell. They called it the program. It was a system that rewarded loyalty and punished weakness. Complete control over every moment of life inside. And it wasn't just happening in one building. By 2016, reports showed gang-affiliated inmates were running similar systems across multiple Rikers facilities. Some officers privately admitted that certain dorms were completely ungovernable. They had to negotiate with gang reps just to get meals served on time. For many inmates, survival now meant submission. If you weren't in a gang, you needed protection. And the only protection came from joining one. You could tell who ran the block just by watching the phones. Only certain people could use them. The rest had to wait or pay. Rent wasn't a secret anymore. It was a way of life. Commissary snacks, ramen noodles, even sneakers were all part of the underground economy. Every bite, every privilege, every phone call had a price. And that price always flowed upward to the gang leaders. The officers knew it. The inmates knew it. Everyone played along, because fighting it meant getting hurt or worse. One former inmate said, "It's like living in a jungle, but the lions wear jumpsuits." Eventually, public pressure forced the city to act. Media reports exposed the brutal gang hierarchy inside Rikers. There were investigations, new policies, even federal oversight. Officials promised reform, more surveillance cameras, better staffing, body scanners for contraband. But reforms couldn't fix fear. Officers were still outnumbered. Gangs still communicated through hidden phones. And corruption, even in small doses, kept the system alive. One gang member later told investigators, "It don't matter what they change. We run this from the inside. Always have." And the numbers backed it up. Slashings and stabbings continued to rise year after year. By the late 2010s, the violence had reached its highest point in decades. By now, Rikers had become a symbol, not of justice, but of chaos. Gangs dictated who lived safely and who didn't. Even transfers between buildings had to be negotiated, because sending a member to the wrong dorm could start another war. Former officers described the environment as unfixable. Inmates described it as the island of no return. The gangs had created a society with its own currency, rules, punishments, and hierarchy. A world where violence was order and silence was survival. It wasn't about power anymore. It was about control. And the people who were supposed to have it, the officers, the city, the state, had lost it completely. By 2019, reports from watchdog agencies and human rights groups finally forced New York City to confront the truth. Rikers Island was out of control and had been for years. The city announced plans to shut it down permanently by the end of the next decade. The reason wasn't just the violence, it was the system itself. A system where gangs ruled dorms, where fear replaced law, and where young men like Luis Santiago lost their lives before they were ever convicted of a crime. Even as the shutdown plan moved forward, violence didn't stop. Because the culture of control, the unwritten island rules, didn't live in the buildings. It lived in the people. And until that changes, closing Rikers might not end the problem. It might just move it somewhere else. Rikers Island was supposed to be a jail, not a kingdom. But when order fails and fear fills the gaps, the ones inside create their own law. In that law, loyalty is survival, power is protection, and silence is everything. This is how gangs control Rikers Island behind bars.